Is Oregon on the cusp of chaos? Welcome to People, Places, and Politics. I'm Patty Milne. We're going to talk about the cusp of chaos today with my friend W. Scott Jorgensen, who is actually the author of The Cusp of Chaos. The book takes a look inside Oregon's capital, talks about the rural-urban divide, and also touches on the last days of the former governor, Kitzhaber's administration. Recap real quickly, Scott is an award-winning small town, in your own words, local newspaper reporter. You've been the news director, you have been a talk show host, and you are chief of staff for Senator Doug Whitsitt's office. So congratulations on all those things. This book, On the Cusp of Chaos, is your third book, and you have your two previous books. Transition was published in 2013, and then Scott's second book, Conversations with Vicatia, was in just last year, 2014, and I understand you have a fourth book that's, and we can talk about that.
That'll be next
year. We can talk about that a little bit later. So, Scott, why did you write the book?
I went back and forth for a while because it's a fascinating world. You've been there, I've been there, and it's always been important to me that people who are outside of the Capitol in those settings feel that they can get an understanding of how it works, and that's really important, and we've kind of seen the consequences of the lack of transparency. So I went back and forth. Should I do Capitol memoirs? And Kitzhaber kind of handed this one to me.
Oh, definitely. Definitely. The title itself, The Cusp, which is sort of the, it's the point, it's the point where the attention is given, the cusp, right where something's going to happen. And then, of course, chaos is all this extreme confusion. So a very interesting title. How did you arrive at that title? What got you to that place to use The Cusp of Chaos?
It was more like when I was explaining the concept to my publisher, because half of the book takes place inside the Capitol in Salem, and then the other half takes place literally all over the rest of the state. And that's to illustrate the urban-rural divide. So you've got chapters from Grants Pass, Pendleton, Seaside, Estacada, and you get that impression at any given time. And there's all these different tensions between, you know, not just the Republicans and the Democrats in the building, but you've got these different interests, and you've got inside and outside of the building, urban and rural. And I mean, even inside the building, you get some scary situations. I was there in 2005 when a man showed up on the Senate floor with a butcher knife. Well, it turned out he was one of my neighbors at the Lee Apartments just a couple of blocks away. He walked there, right? And there was one instance during the session where they were doing a floor vote on the background check bill. And that same day, Oregon State University had their lobby day, so they were passing out balloons, and some of the balloons popped. Right?
Oh dear.
And the thing is that it's a public building, and we want it to be a public building, but there are risks inherent in that. And so, but I do feel like we're in good hands because of the state police that have an active presence in the building. And so the book's dedicated to them and the groundskeepers and the staffers and what I call the unsung heroes of our public institutions, because it does feel a lot of times like we are on that cusp of chaos, but what keeps us from fully getting there is the hard work and dedication of these people who wake up every morning, go to work to try to keep government working for all of us. You know, and there's one chapter that takes place in Grants Pass last April. You had this situation where there was a mining dispute between the Bureau of Land Management and some local folks, and the Oath Keepers showed up. And you know, being from Grants Pass, I know the area, I know the issues, and luckily cooler heads prevailed, but it wouldn't have taken very much at all for that to go terribly wrong. So when I say on the cusp of chaos, both inside and outside the building, we can be there very easily. But we're not, because of the dedicated people that show up and serve us every day.
Who keep us from going over the edge.
Absolutely.
So to speak. So you talk also in the book about the Oregon pride. You mentioned just a moment ago transparency, and do we really have that? I mean, have people been led to believe that Oregon's very transparent and corruption-free, or has it just been covered up well? I don't know how much you want to get into that without giving away too much of what you touch on in the book, but I found that an interesting discussion.
One of the chapters is called Chicago on the Willamette, and it was based on a column I wrote in the immediate aftermath of Governor Kitzhaber's resignation, and it kind of raises that point that we've always kind of seen ourselves as being kind of pure and innocent, and even, you know, my favorite show is Portlandia, and a lot of those characters have that, where they're kind of naive and well-intentioned, and I think in a lot of ways that's a good reflection, and I think 2015 was the year that we truly lost our innocence. And that perception and the way that we thought of ourselves that way, I think, enabled all of this to happen, to where the public was somewhat complacent, and especially with Kitzhaber, the longest serving governor in the state's history. I mean, there were people who had voted for him 4 times to be governor, some who had voted for him several times before that in all the years he was in the legislature, and who thought that the state was in good hands with him because, after all, he's got more experience running it than anyone just about in the whole history of the state. And then we saw the aftermath of that, and I think we're still dealing with it and will be for quite some time. So some of it just has to do with the way that we view ourselves as a state. But, I mean, good governance requires vigilance on the part of citizens to be part of the process. And luckily there was some ethics reform legislation that was passed this last session. There were some measures that would have further improved that, but we'll probably try to pursue that in 2016 as well.
You mentioned ethics. I just participated in a training session and did the section on ethics, and just in reviewing the statutes myself to do the presentation, one of the things that's most jumps out most at me when you talk about trust and the responsibility to be good stewards of and be vigilant to do it. And it's real clear in the statute that the state of Oregon, you know, the government and we the people expect state officials to hesitating a little to use the word report on, but that's what you would be doing, to report on, to disclose, to identify any unethical behavior. That's a real responsibility for any state official, albeit elected officials, but you work at the Capitol, you're an employee, you work with one of the legislators, among all the other things that you do. So you're responsible too when you're aware that there is something unethical taking place, or you have good reason to believe it is. It's your responsibility, it's all of our responsibilities as citizens of Oregon to disclose it, to look into it, and hold people accountable. And so along the lines of what you're saying, I would agree that there might be a little bit more consciousness about it more recently. But when you think about it, and in your book, and Oregon losing its innocence because of what former Governor Kitzhaber did, we do have a number of other elected officials and officials who have done things that they shouldn't have done and have ultimately been held accountable, such as former Governor Goldschmidt.
I don't think he was ever truly held accountable because the statute of limitations, the fact that he can't show his face in public anywhere in Oregon, and I imagine there's probably a spiritual battle going on there if there was anything there at all. In fact, you know, when I worked here, my first session was in 2005, working for former Representative Dennis Richardson, who becomes one of the main characters in the book. We had 2 state representatives arrested. One at the beginning of session, who was a former state rep from here in Salem, and then the other from Corvallis for methamphetamine possession. And that was at the very end of the session. And I read Oregon history, and that's not the first time that something like that's happened. So there were other sessions way earlier in Oregon's history where you had multiple legislators being arrested. But I happen to think that we deserve better than that, and we should expect better than that.
We do. And there are some other officials, other state legislators who also have had to leave their position because of unethical or monetary problems, legal problems, and it's really unfortunate. But so what you're saying, though, is former Governor Kitzhaber really put the spotlight on it, and people suddenly woke up and said, we deserve better.
Well, and I'm really tired of us making the national news for all the wrong reasons. And you look at all the things that Oregon leads the nation in, things like hunger and food stamp use and lowest graduation rate in the country. The fact that we have people going hungry in Oregon, this state should be feeding the whole rest of the world with what we have to work with. And that's one of the themes that comes up. You know, a lot of my background professionally was as a small town newspaper reporter in rural areas in southern Oregon, and more recently in Estacada. And it amazed me because Estacada is not that far from Portland, and I saw a lot of the same issues that I saw in places like Rogue River and Cave Junction, where I'm driving past abandoned mills and the schools have declining enrollment, and it just blew me away that here we have these parallels and kind of this untapped potential. And I love this state. I'm not native. I wasn't born here. I was a Southern California Army brat. Brought up at the age of 14, but I've been here for 20 years, and unless the people of Oregon ride me out of the state on a rail, I'd like to stay if I can help it. And I think we could do so much better than this, but a lot of it has to do with leadership or the lack thereof and the culture. And our state government has the ability and the potential to create the kind of conditions for either poverty independence or prosperity. And I see the direction we've been going, and that's what keeps me waking up every morning and coming to work is wanting to have an influence in that process. And I covered county government down in Grants Pass for 4 years, and it just about made me crazy because here the county had been funded for decades off of timber receipts, and then they started paying them to not cut timber, and it's this battle every couple of years, and half of the counties, including Polk County, are in danger of going insolvent, and I don't really see anybody in the Capitol doing anything about it. And that's part of the dynamic, the book going back and forth. You know, one chapter you're in Salem and hustle and bustle, and then the next minute you're in Cave Junction, and you say, look, everything's on fire. What's going on? Is anyone doing anything about this in Salem? And then you're back in Salem, and you're going, well, some of us care, right? But, here's our chief executive, and he's apparently ordering subordinates to delete emails off of state servers in an effort to avoid prosecution. And to me, that was one of the last straws. As a former reporter, that just offended my sensibilities so much, and it all came crashing down in real time because in very short order you had that, and then the next day, within minutes of each other, a lot of the top Democratic officials who a year prior were more than happy to have their picture taken with him and, hey, come to my fundraiser. They all turned on him all at once and demanded his resignation. It was literally right in the noon hour. And then at that point he realized he was increasingly politically isolated and had to move on and step down for the good of it, because it was a huge distraction at the beginning of the legislative session.
It was.
And we had a lot of work to do. But you had the situation where TV news crews were roaming the halls looking for people to talk to, your phone's blowing up, and people are like, what have you heard? And we're asking people outside the building, I don't know, what have you heard? So that's another one of the themes. And the front cover shot we took at the Lee of the roof of the Lee Apartments, just a few blocks from here. That's where I lived in the 05 session, and my best friend lives there during session, and so we really wanted to capture that. Like, I'm looking at the Capitol, and you're kind of looking over my shoulder to get that feeling that I'd heard so often reporting in these small towns. What are they doing in there? Do they not realize what they're doing to us here in these small towns? The best example I can give is reporting in Estacada. They had this really painful mid-year budget shortfall with the school district. And they had just laid off a bunch of teachers right around Christmas time. And a few months later, we're sitting there in the aftermath of it, and at the school board meeting, they get this report that, oh yeah, by the way, according to the state mandate, we have to replace almost our entire bus fleet because of the diesel emissions. And I just about fell out of my chair.
And who cares about those,
the timing is atrocious. and it's just things like that. You hear about unfunded mandates from the state. To me, that was one of the best examples of it. And we deal with this stuff all the time, especially now, working for Senator Whitsitt. His district it covers 5 counties. It's largely rural. And we have a completely different set of issues than people in the metropolitan area. One of them has to do with biodiesel, for example. It turns out that it doesn't work too well in sub-zero temperatures east of the Cascades. And so we tried to pass a bill to get that fixed because we'd heard complaints from school district officials and from business owners saying, hey, it gels, right?
Oh, yeah.
And so you run this risk, and we actually had an instance of that happening in the district where you had school kids being stranded in sub-zero temperatures in the middle of nowhere. But we tried to pass a bill to do it, and you had lobbyists from the biofuels industry and from the environmental lobby. Oh, we've never heard of any problems with this anywhere whatsoever.
That's really hard to believe when we have so many states that have sub-zero weather that kids are waiting for school buses. That's hard to believe.
And all we were trying to do was just do an exemption during the cold winter months east of the Cascades. And you're not talking a lot of volume here in terms of, oh, now we're suddenly going to become unprofitable. But they were able to form this coalition and kill that bill. And we're just hoping and praying that we don't have any really serious incidents coming up this winter. So we're going to take another go at it come February and try to get this passed so that something terrible doesn't happen. But you don't hear about that in Portland and in Salem. And this last summer was terrible for catastrophic wildfires all throughout the state. That's a huge issue.
It's awful.
And there was a couple of days where it hit here in the valley, and that's all I could think was, well, at least maybe this means that the folks in Eugene, Salem, and Portland will realize what the whole rest of the state has been going through all summer. And you see the pictures that people were posting. In Grass Pass, you couldn't even see the surrounding hills. It was like that back in 2002 during the Biscuit Fire, which was a huge part of shaping my perspective. Because I was reporting. It was my first professional job at a weekly newspaper in Central Point. It's how I met Dennis Richardson. He was a city councilor at that point. And I called the Forest Service, and I said, oh, we were supposed to go thin that out years ago. Why didn't you? Lawsuits from environmentalists. Wow, this is so much better. 500,000 acres burning. And then there's the efforts to go in and to do salvaging, to pick out all the dead stuff and replant so we could have healthy, vibrant forests. Stopped by lawsuits, frivolous lawsuits that were ultimately thrown out of court. But by the time it was done working its way through the process, the timber was no longer economically viable. And you couldn't do it anymore. And that same area burned again this last summer. And it was the same area that burned back in 1987. So you can imagine the frustration in these rural areas, and they feel like their voices aren't being heard in Salem, and I don't disagree with them.
Yeah, so that's the rural suburban, urban divide. So what is it that the urban people feel their voice isn't heard? Or do they?
Well, they should feel well represented for the most part, but it's all about population. And that's another one of the themes of this book is that, like many from Southern Oregon, I had to leave the area. Myself and all my friends I went to high school with, and a lot of us still have family down there, but it got to the point after the Great Recession hit where there was just no way in which to make a living. And so you get this disconnect, and there are chapters where it's kind of a personal story where I had to go down for a funeral at one point because one of my high school friends passed away. And his widow, it was awful. It was leukemia that got him. And his widow said he felt like his friends abandoned him after he got cancer, and it just crushed me. And I had to tell her later that, well, it wasn't that. We had to leave.
Yeah, there's no work.
Yeah, and that's still the case. I see the north end of Grants Pass, and it's dying. The movie theater where we used to go on awkward dates as teenagers is now closed. And the drive-thru had closed quite some time ago. It's now retirement complex. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but that's part of the issues they face down there is demographics. And a lot of the people in Portland look at the situation down there. Oh, your counties are going broke. It's because you have a low property tax rate. Well, the federal government owns half of the county.
Yeah.
And then you also have 40 years of aggressive no-growth policies where it's against the law to build a house, conduct industry, or conduct commerce on most of the land. Well, what do you expect? And then there's the demographics issue. The fact that young people like me who would be willing to pay for and use services like libraries and parks, who have connection to the community, who went to school there, we all had to leave and were replaced by retirees who were on fixed incomes.
Right.
And they're reluctant to raise their property taxes because they would have to pay them with Social Security income. It's just basic demographics.
Yeah.
So there's more to it than you need to pay more taxes. And that's one of those things we really need to bridge that gap because it's not getting any better. And this last legislative session was not kind to rural Oregon. And a lot of these issues I still see going unaddressed.
And why is that? And are there discussions what to do to bridge this gap?
Well, I see the top legislative priorities this last session were low carbon fuel standards and background checks for firearms. Now, this was done at the behest of out-of-state billionaires like former New York Mayor Michael Bloomberg, especially on the background check bill, and Tom Steyer with the low carbon fuel standard. These people aren't from here, and they don't have Oregonians' best interests at heart, but they made campaign contributions, and they got what they paid for. That was the legislative agenda. The first day of the session, low carbon fuel standard, and we're still fighting back on that as best we can. But it's almost this fantasy world because they develop this model and they say, okay, here's Oregon's total carbon emissions and here's how much of it is from transportation. And you say, okay, well, how much of this is from catastrophic wildfires? They don't count any of that. You say, are you kidding me?
Yeah.
Did you drive anywhere outside of the Willamette Valley at any point during this summer? Catastrophic wildfires are bad for the environment. They're bad for public health.
But that doesn't matter in their view.
Right.
That's not a part of the equation.
You can't use that to create carbon taxes and this whole cap and trade scheme that's going to benefit billionaires at the expense of working people.
Yeah, the hypocrisy among the liberals is amazing because they like to criticize Republicans, fiscal Republicans, conservative Republicans, socially conservative Republicans for out-of-state money. They bring in, the liberals, the progressives, nationwide are taking their dollars and their progressive agenda all across the nation and spending much more money to get this agenda instituted nationwide. And
And we got to hear a lot about it because nobody in my boss's rural district, we got all kinds of, thousands of emails and all kinds of phone calls from people adamantly opposed to the background check bill, and maybe one or two calls from people in the district who said that they supported it.
Yeah.
I don't blame these people for not feeling like their voices are being heard, and we do our best to represent them and to work for them, but we're outnumbered. We're in the super minority.
Do you touch in your book on the one-party rule that is, I think, really beginning to frustrate a lot of people? The evidence of the people's voice doesn't matter. They do what they please. Other legislators don't matter, and it's become why go to work when you know that your voice, meaning work at the legislature, legislators, staff, anybody interested in looking at issues that really affect all Oregonians, like getting jobs, increasing the education, the results in education. Do you address that at all, or maybe you're going to address some of that in a future book? So what are your thoughts?
Well, I don't know. I just started grad school, so I think I'll be writing papers for the next couple of years. It's interesting because in the legislature now, I mean, I've gotten to serve in the majority back in 2005, and that was the last time the Republicans had a majority in that chamber. I was working in the House during the 2013 session when we were simply in the minority. and now I've gotten to work as a member of the super minority. And this kind of gets back to my experience interviewing former Governor Vicatia, because he was a member of the phone booth caucus after the '76 elections. And anytime I got frustrated during the session, he told me that was his most favorite memory of being in the legislature. Here they could fit in a phone booth. And anytime I got frustrated, I thought about that and said, well, okay, there's twice as many of us as there were back then. I'm pretty sure our folks couldn't fit in a phone booth.
Is there still one even there?
Right, what's a phone booth? The world's last phone booth standing. But it could be positive too, because our office was actually able to get a lot of things done. And one of the things I really wanted people to understand is that 90% of the bills are non-controversial.
True.
And they pass out of committee unanimously.
It wouldn't matter who's in the legislature, with all due respect to everybody, because it still takes a lot to get a bill passed, and particularly to get a overwhelming majority of them. So having said that, though, there are always going to be things that everybody would vote for it. So there is good stuff that happens, but it's not that difficult.
Yeah, and most of the bills are non-controversial, and they pass unanimously, and there's things like, for example, the criminal trespass statute. They wanted to change a single word in it, and it was "and" replaced by "or the other way around because of some court ruling. Nobody made a stink about that, and why would you? Another had to do with the state surveyors. So we want to change language in statute to match the national standards. These are things that would bore the average person tremendously. I'm sure of it. I mean, I'm a policy geek, and you
even you were bored.
Just about. But that's most of the work we do. But the things that make headlines and the controversial issues that come up are not really insignificant either. And the other thing is that despite all of the differences, this is a very small state. And these circles are very, very small. And I mean, you and I, even before we met, I guarantee you we know hundreds of the same people.
Yes.
And people change roles over times. And so there is a collegiality, because there has to be. In fact, the second chapter is called Just Like Summer Camp. Because it details me coming from Estacada to the Capitol and running into people, and everybody knows everybody. And you say, oh, here's this guy who used to be a staffer who's a friend, and he's now a lobbyist for these guys, and here's a former member, and he's now a lobbyist. And so we all know each other, and it is just like summer camp. And how are the kids? And we just did legislative days. Because we're out of session, but we still have the interim, and the committees are intact.
So I'm going to have to interrupt you, Scott, because we're going to be out of time here in a moment, and I want to be sure that you tell the audience where to find your book, and remind them of the name of it, and then we're going to have to sign off.
Wow, it goes by quick when you're having fun. So it's On the Cusp of Chaos. It's available on Amazon.com, and they also have it at the gift shop inside the Capitol, and recently did a book signing there, and it went well.
Good, very good. Well, thank you again for coming. You'll have to come back and talk to us about your fourth book.
The Campaign Diaries. It should be out next year.
Great. Thank you.